The following is an excerpt from Performer Non Grata by Brian Alessandro, read by Edoardo Ballerini. The American fooled himself into believing he was something else, something more. He had been an investment banker, a charter school pioneer, and a teacher in New York for a short while, all vanity projects and another life ago. He was now a matador, and it had been a good 4 years in this good new life. Though he had trained fast and hard and smart, he never quite got the knack for the sport. He had found his place among the Spaniards in Madrid, learned some Castilian, yet hadn't mastered the craft of fighting and killing bulls. He hoped to move with speed and precision, but was all thumbs with the cape, and slow to steer clear of the picador's lances. Had he been younger, born in Spain or Mexico, and begun training in his youth, like a typical matador, he would have been merciless, better at observing the bull's visual acuity and unusual head movements, smoother with catching the banderillero's cape thrusts, and quicker with noting the bull's territory marking. He had dreamed of putting on an elegant and brutal spectacle. Lacking any semblance of elegance, the fight was merely brutal, primarily due to the American's inaccurate footwork and faulty eye-hand coordination. His red-headed wife, stark against the crowd of olive-skinned, raven-haired spectators, watched with clever eyes and a serpentine posture. Her cheers commanded, even scolded, rather than encouraged. And the imaginary envy the American occasioned from the other matadors excited him, made him feel proud. He had been especially tickled when the Spanish fighter with the thick legs, lissom frame, and royal ancestry fumed at what little attention he did receive. The American, being American, thought himself the best, so to provoke even made-up jealousy from such a celebrated, native, no less, matador was satisfying. The American had a rich interior life, however threadbare its undergirding might have been. And when Theo, ever present and recording all proceedings with his iPhone, described them in his YouTube video series, the primary players in his life, his parents and their lover, would be reduced to pronouns. Theo sat closer to the action than his mother and the family's new closest friend, those on whom he spied and worked into the ever-expanding and complicated plot of their lives, their new, old lives in Madrid. Lorna, the red-headed wife, gasped when the bull charged, missing Risk, her able-bodied husband, by inches, its horn swiping upward and then down, so close to the gut and chest of the man she had tried for years to love. The crowd cheered when Risk sidestepped and snapped the red flag to his thigh in a mischievous mockery of formal Madrid manner. Javier, the thick-legged Spanish fighter of imperial stock, balled his fists and bit his lip every time Risk goaded the bull, instigating an attack. They had entered the third stage of the fight, the tercio de muerte, or part of death, and the picadors had already stuck their lances into the bulky neck of the beast. Banderillas, bright flags, fastened to barbed sticks, plumed from its shoulders like flaccid rainbow wings. It hadn't been a clean fight. In between the life-and-death moments of man and beast locking horns and flag, or muscle and sword, Javier and Lorna would steal glances of one another. They had been seated close to the action, separated by a few fans seeking slapstick more than drama. Javier and Lorna could detect a nervy mix of terror and triumph in one another's eyes, their heaving and breathless bodies sending unambiguous signals to one another. Flush and dry-mouthed, Lorna couldn't resist picturing Javier fighting alongside her wide-shouldered husband, together besting the bulls of the country that stampeded toward them, perhaps rescuing her, perhaps sharing her. And gorged and tense, Javier found it futile to shut out the fantasies of performing lascivious acts with the American woman, before her magnificently built, though charmingly incompetent, husband and all the sneering, screaming, smoldering observers would come to see a bloody good show. And he would show. Risk had been dressed to kill, regal in his traje de luces, a diaphanous suit of lights, coated in sequin and ornate embroidery. It had cost a small fortune, and required the assistance of a squire to get into. He'd been too consumed by his appearance, boasting all the trappings of a genuine Spanish torero, and slid on a mound of dirt and pebbles as the bull trundled over his foot. The crowd screamed, but Lorna was cool. She knew the beast hadn't crushed anything. She knew by the smirk on her husband's face. She would always watch his face to determine how she should feel. Risk rallied and waved the red flag, prompting the bull to circle back around, and without a beat, raged through the flash of passion. Risk turned to the crowd and smiled, waved, and then redoubled his efforts to antagonize the increasingly maddened creature. Javier and Lorna were beside each other, He had wormed his way past the impatient and hostile line of attendees to find his place next to her. She wheezed and tried to focus on the battle before her. The Spaniard brushed her hip with his swollen, misshapen knuckles. Her left leg nearly gave out. Theo expertly, surreptitiously, swung his iPhone back and forth, seizing the fight between the bull and his father and the fling between the Spaniard and his mother. "He's cocky today," said Javier, "and he's not nearly good enough to be cocky." "He's confident," Lorna corrected. She had staked her reputation as an academic on the natural and necessary premise of male confidence. She'd become a reluctant ambassador since those embattled eminent days in New York, and markedly less secure in her diplomatic abilities. Javier leaned in, his hot breath blowing into her ear. "It's a treacherous sport. Confidence here is cocky." In the 4 years he'd spent conversing daily with the Bonaventuras, Javier's English had vastly improved. Lorna tried to smirk, but her cheek twitched spasmodically. She turned away. "He'll be fine." "He's a remarkable athlete, clumsy and unfocused, but what a will! I'd love to fight him myself someday." "The bull?" Javier felt a tingle at his admission. "Your husband." "He'd hurt you," Lorna said, her voice quivering. She pictured Javier inside her. It had been too long. "I'd count on it." Javier grabbed the matador's wife by the wrist. "And I'm certain that I'd hurt him." Lorna yanked her arm away, watched her husband dance to a premature victory before the agitated horned behemoth that sought to kill him. Risk turned to the crowd as the bull skidded to a stop just before him, snorting and stomping. He would do this at the most perilous junctures, to find and make eye contact with Lorna long enough for a wink and a smile. And he did find her in her usual place, first row, center, but not alone this time. Not alone for the past few times. Javier, so easily provoked and enamored, challenged and charmed, stood next to her. Risk snapped to with enough time to dodge the return assault from the bull, whose horn grazed his shoulder, leaving a faint slash that stung. Risk winced, and then laughed at himself for getting caught. Lorna touched her clavicle. Javier licked the sweat away from the back stubble of his top lip. Theo zoomed in on Javier's mouth and caught the small gesture. "This is the way it always goes, does it not?" Javier said, his accent making his voice heavier and angrier than intended. "With you Americans, playing at being locals, acting like you all owned the place, coming in and taking what's not yours." Lorna looked down, blushed. She had left her tenured post at CUNY Merriweather for this? "We've distracted him. He can't afford any distractions." The fight was at its midpoint, and the bull, its neck muscles duly weakened and suffering its first loss of blood, stopped and stared at Risk. Even with the picadores' lances jutting from its morillo, a gnarled mound of muscles on the neck, the beast expressed a strange serenity. And Risk felt a stranger sensation, an ineffable but unshakable melding of guilt and compassion, soon overtaken by a menacing assurance the bull could not hurt him, and he could no longer hurt the bull. There was personhood in the gaze of the non-human animal, and Risk could not deny seeing him, for the beast was now surely a him. Miscalculating his abilities, underestimating the bull's bitterness, Risk lowered his red flag and waited. Lorna touched her breast and cocked her head. Javier crossed his arms and snickered. The bull snorted, shook free the cobwebs, and charged. Risk looked at his wife, and then at the Spaniard beside her. He imagined multiple scenarios, multiple schemes. His arrogance engendered vulnerability. His jealousy permitted distraction. What Theo recorded next would be a marketable sequence, so dynamic that it would yield the highest number of YouTube views in his short career. Amid the pebbles and dirt and hoof shavings, there was a splash of crimson. Risk was gored through his groin. The horn went into the pelvis and punctured bone and intestine, tendon and muscle. Though it spared his genitals by inches, the pain the assault elicited caused him to cry out in unholy anguish and would leave disconnections between anatomy and desire. Lorna shrieked behind hands that shielded eyes that cried. She didn't need to see his face this time to know how to feel. Her husband's strong and tall body locked as it was impaled and went limp as it was tossed through the air. Javier hid a smirk, though his eyes revealed admiration. Theo captured this, too. The American boy missed nothing.